Speaking for Libela today, with me is Dani Ellis, an international volunteer and engineer from UK, currently based in Rojava, who originally arrived to Rojava in order to work with the Make Rojava Green campaign, but due to the war and due to the current circumstances, she joined the RiseUp4Rojava campaign. And first of all, it's nice to have you here today. Welcome. And I'm glad we could have this conversation. So firstly, I'm interested in, you mentioned that working with civil preparation work with RiseUp4Rojava. Could you tell me more about that, more about the campaign and what you do?
Hi, it's good to be able to talk to you. There's kind of amongst the internationalists here in Rojava, there's three different types of work really that's happening. RiseUp4Rojava, the campaign that I'm part of now, is trying to inspire people around the world to rise up in support of this revolution and to oppose fascism, the fascism of the Turkish state and the Turkish armed forces across the world, their suppliers and their government contacts, all these kind of things. This is one part of it. The other work that's going on here, which is very busy, are the civil defense preparations, which are getting cities and villages ready for invasion, preparing them for aerial attack or bombardment by artillery. So this involves making sure people have enough water, have enough fuel, have enough food, barricading places, putting tape on glass, all of this kind of stuff to kind of make the city more resilient. And the third branch is that there are, of course, quite famously internationalists here who are part of the armed forces structures, such as the YPG International, YPJ International, who are themselves fighting on the front lines with weapons.
I can't hear you.
It's gone?
I couldn't hear the last bit you said. If you could just repeat, because the connection.
Sure, no problem. And of course, the third part of the work that internationalists are carrying out here, quite famously, is the armed defense. So YPG International, YPJ International, who themselves are going out and actually fighting on the front lines to defend this revolution.
And you mentioned preparing for artillery attacks, preparing for war. And we've seen that in the past 4 days, this atmosphere of war and uncertainty in Rojava has become more and more pronounced, with Turkey launching, well, a full-blown invasion on the area, on the territory. Could you elaborate more on what the situation is currently like in the targeted areas?
So to give some context, the border between Rojava and Bakur, which is the southern region of Turkey, of Turkish Kurdistan, we could say, where the invasion is being launched from, this is something like 800 or 900 kilometers long. While the Turkish armed forces have been attacking cities all the way along this border, there are two spots really which have been hit the most hard, which are Giresbi and Serikanye, or Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain in Arabic. They've been hit extremely hard with major air assault, artillery bombardment, armored vehicles, and significant numbers of the Turkish proxy forces. These are former ISIS, Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra fighters who fight under the banner of this so-called national army, I think they're calling it. There are videos now circulating of these people shouting ISIS slogans and chants, death to the disbelievers, takbir, things like this, as they're riding into battle wearing Turkish uniforms, Turkish patches on their shoulders, on Turkish tanks or armored personnel carriers. In these places, life is extremely hard. My understanding is that in Serikanye, nearly all civilians have left or have tried to leave. Many of those who are trying to leave now are being hit by airstrikes as they are leaving. All vehicles are being targeted, even ambulances. in Tel Abyad or Giresun, the life isn't. I don't think all of the civilians have left yet, but there's still a major evacuation underway. It's clear that these are the areas which are being focused on, and we're expecting the Turkish armed forces and their proxies to try and break here so that they can flood the rest of the region freely through the border wall.
The situation with civilians, it's really not surprising that so many civilians have left and so many are displaced if we think about what you just said about Turkey and Turkish proxy forces. But we also have to take into account that this entire situation was by large, provoked by the US decision to abandon the Syrian Democratic Forces, which seems, it's not enough to say strange, since the Syrian Democratic Forces were the ones who fought against ISIS throughout the past years, which was seemingly the joint goal of both the SDF and the US. So do you suspect that there might be any underlying interest on the US part that rendered this Turkish invasion imminent?
You know, it's one of the really interesting things about this is that the sort of the old understanding, the older rules of geopolitics have seemed to have been just thrown out of the window now that Trump is involved. He's unpredictable. He seems to side with whoever he spoke to on the phone last. He's highly susceptible to things like flattery, and all credit to him, President Erdogan in Turkey has managed to play the American president extremely well. He's managed to convince him of many things. I actually don't doubt the sincerity of some of the American members of government and military commanders, and people like Brett McGurk, who is the American administrator here. I think they do genuinely believe in the SDF. I think they do genuinely believe in the Kurds and their partners when they make statements. But at the same time, like we can't have any misgivings. Like, this is a stateless anti-capitalist society. This is not the kind of society that America has ever allowed to exist, or indeed that any empire really has ever allowed to exist. If we think of places like revolutionary Spain, so this feeling is reflected in the thoughts of the SDF commanders. Not long after I arrived in Rojava, I went to Deir ez-Zor, to Albagos for the last campaign of against ISIS, and the military commanders I spoke to there said to me that it's fantastic having these American forces as our partners. We get on extremely well. We have a huge amount of mutual respect, but we understand that politically we are not aligned. That we have to be our own defense. We have to stand up for ourselves. One day they will leave. Our long-term goal should be that all foreign forces leave Syria. So to try and answer your question shortly, I don't think it's really possible to sum up the political situation with the Americans in a single sentence. I think it's extremely complex. I think the administration here has, and particularly the military commanders here, have used the situation as well as they possibly could, but also never been so naive to think that the Americans wouldn't at some point leave us in the dark.
It's interesting. What I gather is, of course, what has been pretty evident throughout the last years, that this alliance between the SDF and the US has mostly been an alliance made out of pure necessity. And what you said, Rojava is this anti-capitalist entity that, we cannot expect to just be left alone, because it's simply not in the interest of forces such as the US for such an entity to exist. And taking that into account, and also taking into account many reports coming in about ISIS regrouping, Turkish artillery attacks, even on Kobane once again, Turkish proxy forces. What can we expect in the future? Is there a certain scenario that we can be prepared for? Can we? I hope it's not going to be the scenario like the siege of Kobane in 2014, but it doesn't seem impossible at the moment.
You know, I really wish I could say something certain about this. We really don't know. We try to make predictions. It's so hard. It's so hard to imagine what the outcome of this will be, both in the local battles and in the long term. You know, the 5 to 10 year perspective. The one thing I can say is the people here that I've spoken to are absolutely certain they're going to win. I met and spoke to the military commander for this canton that I'm in yesterday, and he was 100% certain that they would gain some kind of victory, but it would of course be an extremely costly victory, and the region will not be the same again. Things are not going to just go back to how they were. There will be devastation. I think personally, I'm expecting there to be a relatively long, relatively lengthy urban warfare. The Turks have a significant number of tanks, which work well in the low-lying flat regions here, but the one advantage that the Kurdish allies really have is in city warfare. They showed this over and over again against ISIS. They're extremely adept at it. What I really hope for is that they can bog down the Turkish military and their proxy forces, these Islamists. I hope they can bog them down long enough in this war that the Turkish state can no longer maintain, either politically or financially, a sort of Vietnam-like situation or Fallujah type situation in which there is a huge rate of attrition.
And to ensure the resistance against these forces to be possible now with the loss of US support, what is being done on the ground? What is being done to try and ensure that resistance is successful?
So I can't go into detail about the military preparations that I've seen, but I can give you a sense that they've been going on since before I arrived here. I arrived here at the end of last year, the end of 2018. They had already started preparing for war with Turkey at this point. This was before ISIS was over. They knew, because of the attack on Afrin and the occupation of Afrin, that the next target would be the rest of Rojava. Now, the Americans, as part of the security agreement, did get the SDF to remove a lot of their fortifications along the border. But just back from the border, there are still vast fortifications, absolutely vast. Like I personally believe it's one of the biggest engineering projects in the world at the moment, or was before the war broke out. So these are physical fortifications, you know, concrete structures, bunkers, these kind of things, but also stockpiles of food, fuel distributed everywhere. But also not just military, like in society, there is a real sense of civil defense and civil duty. There are these wonderful units. There's been one of my favorite things witnessing Rojava have been what's called Hepage and Hebege. These are how to describe them? They're essentially the men's civil defense units and the women's, or the general civil defense units and the women's civil defense units. They are mothers, fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers who have taken up their duty with. They wear these lovely sort of brown waistcoats. They walk around with their rifles, and they make sure that society is functioning well. Usually, in terms of peace, you know, if someone gets drunk and has a fight on the street, they're the ones who come and sort out the problem. Now, in terms of war, they are begging to go to the front to look after their kids. They are organizing society. They're burning tires so that the aircraft can't see through the smoke. They're putting sheets up in the streets so that snipers can't see down the street. This is one of the most inspirational parts of Rojava is watching these units at work.
To hear what the people do, it's so admirable, because this is a civil type of defense in a way, right? And I remember recently I saw this photo, I believe it was taken in Sarakanye, of such civil defense members, and it was a photo of a young woman and an old woman armed with assault rifles. And
yeah,
in one way, it's so sad to see something like that, but on the other hand, it's very hopeful and in a way very symbolic to see the women defending themselves, because in a way it represents the defense of the entire ideological background of the Rojava revolution that is based firmly in women's liberation. So how do you see the role of women specifically, be it military on or non-military in this moment?
Absolutely central, like right at the center of organizing more or less every part of society. Every structure in society has what's known as a Gishti structure and a Khazar structure. The Gishti is general for men and women. Khazar is self-organizing for women. And of course, there's a crossover. Like we see with YPG and YPJ, this is the same kind of thing. Women have been, from the beginning of this revolution, central to this kind of organizing. In fact, long before even the revolution started in Rojava, in other parts of Kurdistan, women have really long been a central organizing part. Particularly Congress Star, the sort of organizational body of the women's movement, has been the driving force behind a lot of developments in society. And the women's self-defense units, the YPJ, they don't just fight, they also go to families and make sure that the patriarchal structures in these families, the fathers, the uncles, the grandfathers, speaking to them and making sure that they allow their daughters to go and join the battle, to go and join the structures, and are not being trained to stay at home and cook and clean and be a good housewife. It's just been absolutely essential. The YPJ unit that I lived with in Ablagos for some time, in Deir ez-Zor, there were women there who just a year, I think, before had been living under ISIS.
Wow.
Something like 19 years old, and a year later, having been expected to be essentially a birthing machine for the rest of their lives, were now on the front lines fighting with heavy weapons.
That's amazing.
And no men got them to do this. The YPJ had self-organized to go and find these people and explain to them and change their lives. And like, really, the most fundamental and the most core part of the revolution is the self-organization of women.
And I would just like to make a slight digression from the main topic and ask, of course, women kind of challenging these patriarchal norms in the front line. That's been evident, definitely. But what I'm also interested in, what is something that we can't really sometimes gain access to if we're not in Rojava, is this civil aspect of challenging patriarchy and patriarchal norms. How is that being dealt with?
There's a number of ways this is being done. There is a kind of, in some ways, I want to say legislative, not in terms of law, but in terms of structural organization. Every structure, every organizing body must have at least 40% women on it. This in itself creates a huge difference. It forces women to be central in decision making, and that in itself, over several years, starts to create a fertile grounds that female leadership can grow. Then there are the teachings of the movement, coming from genealogy, coming from the writings of Abdullah Öcalan, which really stresses this fundamental principle that no society can be free until every last woman is free. Abdullah Öcalan wrote extensively and writes extensively on the subject of genealogy in the women's movement, and men learn this just as much as women do, and that really changes.
That is important.
But I think ultimately the real the seed which really started it off was the foundation of the Women's Army in the first place, in the 1980s, and particularly the growth of it in the 1990s, within the ranks of the PKK in the mountains. Ultimately, the women's movement in all other parts of Rojava and in Europe, the Kurdish women's movement in Europe, all came from this seed that women demanded to have their own army so that they were not beholden to the decisions of men. And I think not only did that inspire women, but by fighting on the front lines with men in the mountains, these women proved to men that they were a legitimate force in every possible way. And at the time, like, we imagine patriarchy now, what you and I have experienced, like, it was nothing compared to what women growing up
I believe
in the 1970s. So yes, I think really this is where most of it came from. But of course, in the last 20 or 30 years, it's developed in myriad ways.
It's really amazing to see how everything has developed so far. And this saying that all people will be free where women are free, it also makes me think that it's important to take it into account for the very reason that women, especially in the areas of conflict, are usually the most targeted group, and a group targeted in very specific ways through kidnappings, war rapes, and the like, which we could have witnessed on Sinjar or only a year ago in Afrin. Are there instances of something like that repeating again now with the ongoing invasion? Are there any? Well, I wouldn't call them. Calling them problems doesn't suffice, but are there any evidence of
war crimes?
Specific war crimes? Yes, I was trying to be nice against women.
But so I mean, it's day 4 so far. The SDF have really managed to put up a really enormous fight so far, and there's very little. Even though some towns or villages have been captured, there's not really much evidence coming out of these areas. But we have absolutely no doubt that things will repeat themselves. Not just because it's not just a general sense or a fear. The people currently flooding across the border from Turkey, these militias who are trained and funded and given weapons and material by the Turkish state, these are the same people who are fighting in the ranks of ISIS, of al-Nusra, of al-Qaeda, in exactly the same places before. You know, Serikanya suffered terribly under ISIS. I think it's at Serikanya that there are still these cages in public areas that were used for putting the bodies of the condemned, left there as a memorial. The same people that were commanding these ISIS units are now back in, thanks to the Turkish state, are now back in Rojava. We have absolutely zero doubt that these same war crimes will absolutely happen. Mass executions, rape as a weapon of war, enslavement of women, forced marriage, it's undoubtedly going to happen. These people will be resettled in areas that are captured and held by the Turkish-backed forces, and history will repeat itself. And the disgusting thing is, not only do we have reams and reams of evidence of this happening, first under ISIS, now under Turkish occupation or Turkish jihadist occupation in Afrin, but we have evidence, open source intelligence groups such as Bellingcat and the Rojava Information Center, they have proven a link between these ISIS militants and members of the Turkish-backed forces. We have all this evidence. We have all the evidence you could ever need, and the international community is doing nothing. The UN Security Council did not provide a statement. The EU did not provide a statement because Hungary, Viktor Orban, vetoed this. It's pathetic. There is no plainer evidence of war crimes in the making than right here and right now. And really, people here feel very much as they've always felt, that this old Kurdish phrase, "We have no friends but the mountains."
And it's interesting to see that even though there have been so many reports from the people in the area going out into the world about these events, about these crimes going on, but the reaction from the majority of the world just didn't happen. And now we have this military operation called Peace Spring, allegedly designed to enforce peace and stability. It's interesting to think, for whom? What does seem to be the actual goal of the operation?
Ethnic cleansing. I mean, it's that simple. It is ethnic cleansing. For hundreds of years now, first under the Ottomans and then under the Ataturk and the Turkish regime that's followed, Kurds have been treated absolutely terribly. They've been forced to integrate into Turkish society. Not just Kurds, but famously, of course, Armenians in the Armenian genocide, Assyrians, Turkmen. The Turkish state really seeks to assimilate, to expand and assimilate, as they have done in Armenia and Kurdistan and Cyprus. The same thing is happening now. They see an opportunity. They see that Assad is weak. They see that the American government through Trump is weak. They see that the SDF is war weary, that they've been fighting ISIS for a very long time. And of course, they see that they have under their control, more or less, politically at least, the Kurdish forces in Bashur, in Iraqi Kurdistan. Even though there is a huge amount of support amongst general people in southern Kurdistan for this region, politically, the government there is not really able to help or willing to help. So they see that we have no friends. They see that we have nowhere to go, and they see that we have been weakened. And they're taking this opportunity to not just to militarily inflict damage on the Kurds, but to capture large areas of highly fertile land, huge oil fields, and to resettle millions of refugees in a belt that will protect them in some way from the Kurds. These people they want to resettle absolutely should return to Syria, but these people are mostly not from the Kurdish region of Syria. So undoubtedly, the goal is ethnic cleansing. It's imperialism, it's annexation, and it's ethnic cleansing.
So we can see that the situation from what you've described in Rojava, the state of human rights right now is really dire. And a lot of people, especially on the left side of the political spectrum, a lot of activists in Europe, for example, have been asking themselves, what can they do? What can people who are not on site do to help, and what can they do to bring attention to what is going on?
I've been asked this so many times by so many of my friends. I recently made quite a long post about it on Facebook. I'd say the number one thing you can do is spread the word. And I don't just mean clicking on share or retweet. I mean like actually going and physically speaking to your friends, your family members, your parents, your co-workers, your colleagues. Speak to your trade union representative, try and get the general secretary to make a statement, try to speak to celebrities that you know, to politicians. Tell people what is happening here. Because when you describe to people what's happening, and you can prove what's happening, there's so much information out there, well documented and verified information about what's happening. People get angry. They get really, really angry. I think this is one of the best things we can do, is simply to spread the word, let people know what's happening, and from there resistance will grow. This is what we're trying to do with RiseUp4Rojava campaign. From there, we're also organising demonstrations. We're organising groups that hold meetings to perform direct actions, things like banner drops. We are doing interviews like this. We're speaking to the media. We're speaking to politicians. We're campaigning. We're lobbying. You can provide material support, particularly Hevesor Kurd is the Kurdish Red Crescent. They have a donation page on their website. They are the best aid organisation in the region. They are everywhere. Quite often, particularly at the beginning of the year, during the worst crises, the end of ISIS, they were often the only NGO in the region that was operating. They are amazing people. So if you can provide a donation to them, even just 1 or 2 euros, this is fantastic. Really, like, be creative. Use the skills you have. If you're a translator, you can help us translate things. If you're good at websites, if you're good at graphic design, you can help us with these. If you're good at video editing, you can help us make videos. I've been saying this to people, and people always seem surprised when I say it, but you can come here. Like, you don't have to stay at home. Right now, you can't come here because the border is closed. But the authorities here, if you can really call them authorities, the organisational movements, they will be arranging huge numbers of people to cross, mostly the Kurdish diaspora in the Middle East, but people from Europe as well, especially former YPG and YPJ volunteers. It won't be long until there's a mass mobilisation call out, and you can come. I know it might seem like Turkey are an unstoppable force, but they really are not. There will be a long resistance here, and we need that help. We need that solidarity. This is like Franco returning from Morocco. This is our moment to defend this revolution, and we can't let it go the same way it did in the 1930s.
Of course, because even though solidarity from other parts of the world is important, of course, nothing can be done if there aren't actual people at the actual location.
Absolutely.
But I also understand that people might feel reluctant going there. But I seriously have to say I admire people like you who dare to take that step. Because we are here, we're used to this certain level of routine and security, and knowing that nothing will happen, even though it might sometimes be an illusion. And there, it seems like you never know if you're going to survive the next day. And it takes a lot of bravery to make that step.
I think it helps that, for one, we certainly feel very safe here. You know, that some of our friends and comrades in places like Serikanye, they really do feel like every day could be their last, every hour could be their last. Where I am, it's fairly safe, and the airstrikes or the artillery bombardment, when they hit, they're relatively far away. They're a few kilometers. So, but what really helps more than anything else is the fact that the comrades I'm with are some of the best human beings I've ever met. They are, as this war situation hit, everybody fit into their roles like smoothly, like a well-oiled machine. We're working extremely well. So
we had a bit of technical difficulties, but you were talking about how people are getting well organized and ready to defend the revolution, which is a wonderful thing to hear, of course. And still, a lot of people are wondering whether it's going to be enough this time around. So could you give us a little bit of hope for all of those people who wonder, is there even going to be a Rojava soon? What can we expect?
I think the thing that's given me the most hope is speaking to people on the ground here. Even though the energy in the streets has started to come down a bit, shops are starting to close. When you walk out in the evening, especially on a Friday, families are still sitting outside their houses with a table and cups of tea, drinks, having a cigarette, talking to each other. They ask you to come over and sit with them. They ask you to come to prayers with them. They're defiant. They're sort of letting life is going on for most people here. And yes, certainly in the cities where the bombing's been really heavy, where the fighting's been really heavy, they've had to leave. But for if you speak to the average person, at least in the city that I'm in cities like Komishlo, they think we can win this. There are protests every day. In fact, there are 2 protests today in the city I'm in. People are defiant. They think we can win. So who am I to? Yeah, who am I to say that we're not? Like, I think we've got a chance. I think that chance is much greater if people back in Europe, in the United States, and the rest of the world, if they join us in some way, if they campaign, if they get out on the streets there, like, we have a much better chance. So if you call yourself a feminist, if you call yourself an anti-capitalist, you really, like, this revolution is one of the most important things that has happened for us. It's a concrete working proof to everybody that these ideals can work and create a better and more just society. And it is a better and more just society here for all its problems. So if you call yourself an anti-capitalist, if you call yourself a feminist, you really need to do something to help this revolution. Even if you can't come here, there are many things you can do, but doing nothing is not enough.
That is a great way, a great message to finish off this interview, and really thank you for taking your time and talking about all this. And it's been really interesting hearing things like that from the first person perspective, let's say. So yeah, for all our readers, actually listeners in this case, this has been Dani Ellis for Libela.org. I am Katarina Pavičić-Ivelja.